So Greg Wolk is a retired trial lawyer and writer. He serves on the boards of directors of the Jefferson Barracks Heritage Foundation and the National U.S. Grant Trail Association, both based in St. Louis, and his works include Friend and Foe Alike, A Tour Guide to Missouri Civil War, and numerous magazine articles focused on the Civil War in Missouri. His great-great-grandfather was a private in the 21st Illinois Infantry, which mustered in where? Who remembers? Rhymes with ring seal, starts with an S. Yes! You guys know this. And marched with Grant. So Grant was given that regiment, right, when its colonel was relieved of command and took them out to points west. So Mr. Wolk is going to talk about John and Jesse Fremont. So let's welcome him.
Greg.
Yes, Greg.
And thank you all for coming tonight. And let me say to get started that I recently saw the old courthouse in St. Louis, and if you haven't been there yet, please go there. And I bring that up in part because they've taken the parts that they've renovated in the old building on the first floor, and it's really now a shrine to the Red Interior Scott. And while I'm on that subject, meaning African Americans in the Civil War, I want to thank Doris Keevan Frank for all that she's done to promote Archer Alexander's legacy. And I might say that we are blessed in this area with African American soldiers, including Spotswood Rice, if any of you have heard of him. He's now become very popular in Cape Girardeau. Spotswood was the guy who wrote the letter from Camp Fremont, talking about Kitty Diggs, who had his daughter while he had escaped from slavery. But now, my presentation, I want to introduce another man that I hope will become a household word. Another African American who deserves mention, and I'm going to mention in the book that I've written, there's a flyer out there, if you want to pick it up. His name is Hiram Reed, and my talk tonight is going to involve, I think as advertised, both the campaigns that Fremont, and I say the Fremonts waged in Missouri because she was a lieutenant. But I want to again talk about, as advertised, how John Fremont, and I think with his wife, were responsible for freeing the first slave that was ever freed on the authority of the United States military. And that was a fellow named Hiram Reed. And before I get even further into that, I want to ask you too, I've got some cards back there that have a QR code. I'm appearing here as part of the Missouri Humanities Speakers Bureau. And so you need to comment, probably before you leave the room would be great, provided that, of course, you approve of my speech. Never mind. Anyway, let's get this PowerPoint on the road. And as you know, we're talking about John Charles Fremont. Just a little bit of background for him. Fremont was born in 1813 in Savannah, Georgia. He would ultimately become a very famous explorer and topographical engineer, and his job and his trips out to California underpin this whole story about when he was in Missouri. He was here for 100 days, not 101, not 99, but he was here for 100 days. And my book that's coming out will talk about a variety of things. But to summarize very briefly, what you're going to hear about is how did John C. Fremont get to Missouri in the beginning of the Civil War? How he made noise that the people in Washington didn't want to hear, and particularly about this enslaved population in Missouri. We're going to talk about, and my favorite, what I call the Grand Campaign to Springfield. Many of you, I'm sure, are probably aware that in the midst of his tenure out of headquarters in St. Louis, he launched a massive overland campaign starting from Jefferson City, ending in Springfield, at a place called, what now is Zagoni Park, but it is ended in an event called Zagoni's Charge on October 25, 1861. And then lastly, as you see, I'm going to talk about how it ended. Specifically, I'll tell you how an October 7 order from the General-in-Chief that fired John Fremont on November 2nd, 1861, became an October 24 order, almost as if magic. But the basic theme that we're talking about is Fremont getting to Missouri, making enemies everywhere he went, conducting a textbook campaign that was frankly a useless exercise. And so let me begin with the meat of it. Now, this is an ad that predates the Civil War by a few years. And the reason I bring it up is, I'll give you a chance to read it, but this is an ad for a steamer company. And all of these are the boats that they operated. And I want to direct your attention to this one in particular, the J.C. Swan. Can anybody tell me or tell us all what the J.C. Swan was most famous for? Okay, I built in a hint. Does that help you? This is a part of an engraving depicting the conflict on May 10th. Yeah. Well, the J.C. Swan was the boat that arrived on the St. Louis levee the night before Camp Jackson. Okay. The J.C. Swan had stopped in Baton Rouge where it loaded all these armaments, ammunition, everything else, and they put it in crates called Barba, if you recall. And the reason I'm going to talk about the J.C. Swan, as you'll see, comes to light later in the talk, but let me first of all get to the next subject. First of all, you'll notice, of course, the images. On the left is Jessie Benton Fremont. She was the second oldest daughter of Thomas Hart Benton. Okay. She was, as Greg pointed out. She was named the same as her brother, who was Jesse without an I, and she was named also for Thomas Hart Benton's father, whose name was Jesse. Jesse was all the rage in terms of the Washington social scene. Her father, who was quite a scholar himself, as you may know, it is said that he raised her as if she was a male back in those days. And it seemed the two of them had the most connection between them. Jessie was, in addition to being a very attractive woman, she was a writer, and she basically found that her job after she married Fremont when she was, they say 16, but probably she was 15. She was his protector essentially for the rest of nearly the rest of their marriage. And of course, this is Thomas Hart Benton. I guess he needs no introduction in terms of what he did for Missouri and what he did for the entire country, except probably for his family, as I'll get into. So this is a little background, gets us up to the point I want you to be, starting with Fremont's 100 days in Missouri. And the rest of the background I want to show you is encapsulated in this photograph. Okay. This is a photograph taken about 1860 by the pioneer photographer in California, a guy named Carlton Watkins. And the reason he photographed this picture, that is Jesse Benton Fremont gazing out across San Francisco Bay, he was engaged to take pictures of the gold mine that the Fremonts found they had after the gold rush occurred, because Fremont was going to Europe to try to get people to invest in that entity, which was failing by the time 1860 rolled around. This photograph captures, I think, what is the story of Jesse Benton Fremont, and the one that I'm trying to tell. This is a house that she bought, that her name was the only name on the deed. California's Constitution, enacted in 1850, had eliminated the right of coverture. Okay. As I will mention in my book, or as you will see, there's a variety of reasons she might have bought that with her own money. One, that her father died 2 years before this, so she would have had some money in her own name, and/or John Fremont was kind of a ne'er-do-well and was having financial problems at the time. But the long and short of it is, Jesse dreamt essentially of this house, and she lost it tragically after the Civil War started. She's gazing out. What you see in the near background is Alcatraz Island, actually. So it's on the site of what's now Fort Mason. And Fort Mason was built during the Civil War. They took her property in order to build it, and then she never got paid for it. Now, one of the things I want you all to understand, and hopefully will enlighten you with, again, you all are scholars of the Civil War. I think, are there any George McClellan fans in the audience? Because I'm going to insult them just terribly. No, I didn't think so. McClellan, as we all know, took over. Actually, his tenure as tied with Fremont. There were three major people in the U.S. Army. It was old Winfield Scott, who was the general-in-chief, and then McClellan and Fremont. McClellan and Fremont had the same date of seniority, and so there were three people at the top of the Army. Two of them were neither senior or junior to the other. And one consequence of McClellan's habits, as we all know, is that the Army of the Potomac and all the armies around Washington went nowhere from the time he took command until he headed south, apparently reluctantly, to take part in the 7 Days campaign outside of Richmond. In the meantime, of course, the national news-consuming public was anxious for news of the Civil War. And as this illustration shows, and I'll explain, the sketch artists for the two major weekly illustrated newspapers. One was Leslie's, the other was Harper's Weekly. They came out here. Reporters from the main newspapers in New York and in Boston came out here because there was nothing to cover back there. And so they, I guess, had a field day, not just with the campaigns that Fremont, some of which he started and didn't finish, but also the, how should I say, the escapades on the home front that were going on during these 100 days. Let me see now the next. So this is a drawing by, I'll move on to that. This is the other one, the one I want you to pay attention to. The other artist was Henry Lovey. He's left a legacy. There's a website you can go to. It's called, well, I got it there. The Becker Collection. If you go look for that, it's from Boston College. They have hundreds of drawings by these artists that were out here and then on the East Coast who drew scenes such as this. This is a camp scene, but also drew scenes, I'm going to show you a couple of them, of actual battles and actual battlefields in action. I think you all probably realize, I hope I'm right, but all the thousands of photographs taken during the Civil War, there wasn't one that depicted a battle in progress. Not one. But as a substitute for that, Lovey and Simplot were running around all over the state following Fremont, and they were, I'll explain a little bit of how this worked. You won't be able to see this, but these are Lovey's notes down here. And what he would do, he would sit and he would draw a scene, and he would make notes to the people who were going to engrave these for publication in the National Weekly News. And these notes point out where John Fremont is, where his wife is, his kid, and this is, and actually he dates it on October 6, 1861. This was Fremont's camp in Jefferson City. He would leave the camp in Jefferson City on the next day, October 7th, and then begin his, I guess I'd say, epic campaign for Springfield. Well, and I did want to point out too, these three fellas here, Lovey just described as Hungarians. And it's important to know that because there were a whole bunch of Hungarian officers who joined in with Fremont because there were a whole lot of people in St. Louis and in Missouri that were born in Europe who came over, whether they're Hungarians, Germans, Czechs, the whole gamut. And I guess my theory is they were especially anti-slavery, partly because of their own experiences before they immigrated. They were good soldiers. And so it brought a lot of heat on Fremont that he was bringing all these foreigners in, but they served him well and served as best they could under very, very trying circumstances. Oh, and just to mention further, when these drawings were sent and they would be delivered in hand, there was a team of wood carvers ready to go. And what they would do is they would engrave these into small blocks, like 2-inch, 3-inch blocks. And this was so that the two newspapers could have a whole team of carvers working and making beautiful, beautiful final prints out of it. And they could get an engraving based on this, which did appear in the Harper's Weekly. Into the news, hungry fans within about 2 weeks of whatever happened. So again, Missouri got a whole lot of publicity. I mean, we wanted publicity this time, pretty much for free. Now, here is an example of one of Lovey's drawings in its final form, as engraved and as published. And I wanted to point out briefly here, this is a marker that stands on the site of this charge. It has an interesting history all by itself, which is the marker was erected about 1930, and it wound up in like a creek bottom sort of nearby, but in absolutely the wrong place. And just in 2019, the town got that picked up, put it in the right place, and now it's there to be seen. It tells a story, you can't read it, but it tells the whole story quite accurately about Zigoni. You've all heard of Charles Zigoni, I suppose. Everybody knows that. Charles Zigoni was a Hungarian. He had been a soldier in his native Hungary, and he had fought as what's called a hussar in Hungary, dating back to like the 1400s. There was a tradition about horsemen, cavalry, and that's how Zigoni was trained. He got on the wrong side of politics in Hungary and then somewhere else, and he wound up living in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, along with the boss he served. But he emigrated to the U.S., and we see as a result this, I would say, magnificent charge, properly.
Where is that?
That is in Springfield, Missouri. Oh. And it's, I'm sorry I didn't mention, that was an end game of his trek across southwest Missouri. And here is the Lovey original drawing, and something I have here, a lot of been telling a little bit of the story. I mentioned, I guess, that there are no, to my knowledge, any photographs of any battle in process, in existence. But what you see here is, I guess, one of Lovey's best drawings, or most famous drawings, and it gives you an indication of how he worked. You see, he's drawn a few horses and a man with a flag, and then he's just indicating, well, he's going to put more over there. And what you saw in the final project had a whole line of soldiers. This is, I don't know, it looks like a pixie or something that he must have been having some fun with. But here's the story of Zigoni's charge, which takes us back to the beginning of this grand campaign in southwest Missouri. First of all, Fremont was in the hot seat pretty much the entire time he was out here. My own judgment is, and it's up to you all individually to research it and find out, but that really he was in trouble because the Blair family both first supported him, suggested that he be put in charge of the West, and then within about a month and a half decided they didn't want him. Of course, the Blair family threw a lot of weight around. And one reason why, frankly, is that the Blairs, the father and the two sons, Frank in St. Louis, and Montgomery, also from St. Louis, but he was Lincoln's postmaster general. They had been Democrats, like Jesse's father was. They changed in 1856 to support the brand new Republican Party, of which and for which John Fremont was the first presidential candidate. His status as the first Republican candidate for president would cause, I would say, nightmares for Abraham Lincoln once the Blairs were trying to get him fired. And in fact, somewhere in the process of this campaign, basically Fremont threatened that he would go back in and try to get the nomination away from Lincoln, and he didn't do it. But anyway, the whole thing was wrapped up in politics. One of the politics is the thing shown here, and you can barely see, but I pull it up. This thing right here, and what you're seeing is two men in a flagpole with a first national Confederate flag. The man, one of those men of September. When Price retreated from Lexington after that battle, he left some soldiers there who were guarding officers who had been captured along with the privates. The privates were exchanged. But in any case, Frank White just put together this troop of cavalry and finds out that some of the prisoners in Lexington are under threat of execution. He takes his band and he rides all night long, and he gets there. He takes Lexington back from the Confederates. Then he's directed to go and join Fremont while Fremont is heading southwest. He's taking the route of the old Butterfield Trail. Fremont is. I don't know if you all are familiar at all with the Butterfield Trail, but it's now a National Historic Trail. And it was, the road was built in the late 1850s. The Butterfield only lasted 2 or 3 years, then the telegraph came along. But Fremont used that old road, and he used the old relay stations for that stagecoach route to get from Tipton, Missouri, down to Springfield. Frank White joined up with Zagoni, headed to Springfield in the last days of the campaign. And what had happened was, after riding, I think about 170 miles with his brand new troop of cavalry, he got exhausted and or sick, and while they were heading to Springfield, he said, I'm going to have to rest. So Zagoni said, well, take a guard and rest. There's a friendly farmer. You can do that. Zagoni then reaches a point about 2 miles north of Springfield, and he's discovered by a foraging group. They capture all the people, Confederate foraging party. They captured everybody but one, but then they were fearful that one would report that they were, nobody knew yet that Fremont was headed away. So they found a guy who took them off the road to Springfield and took them around to the west, where they would arrive at the field that you see pictured here. Well, nobody thought to leave somebody on the road when Frank White got back in the saddle into Carrington. And so he and his small group of officers with him run right into the Confederates north of Springfield, and they're taken prisoner. I guess I would say Henry Lovey was such a detail person that he captured the man in that flag is in fact Frank White. Okay? The Confederates took him prisoner. They put him out on the field as a shield, and he did manage to survive. But the next thing that happened was this: Zagoni had his charge. He lost about 20 men, sadly and tragically, because it was not a fight that Fremont was going to win. I'd say he won this little skirmish. But Zagoni with his crew of horsemen, they called them Fremont's bodyguard, immediately left Springfield once they had successfully charged on this deal. Frank White then, well, the Confederates did retreat finally. Frank White wound up being the senior officer in charge of what was left of the Union soldiers who attacked. And lo and behold, comes a Confederate officer who wants permission to go off in the field and bury their dead. And Frank managed to fool him into thinking that the entire, I guess, 300 men who had galloped across his field were still in town, so they learned about their business. And Frank White finally escapes, and that's that. Well, I have time to talk a little bit more about Charles Zagoni, who you see over on the left side. This is now a engraved drawing that would have been taken. I don't have the drawing that Lovey originally used as any others, but this appeared on the front page of the Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper on November 23rd, 1861, which was about 3 weeks after General Fremont had been fired. But it was such a remarkable happenstance, I guess I would say, for a Union populace who was hungry for news and hungry for victories, that they painted this as a great, great victory, and they honored 19 men who had died in the charge. They died needlessly and uselessly, quite frankly, because first of all, there were not enough of them to hold Springfield. Another interesting tidbit that I posit also is Zagoni rode ahead with his troop the last 50 miles that separated Fremont's army from Springfield. In any case, this is, I guess I would say, an interesting drawing, and you see that the men are carrying the caskets of, I think there were 19 members of Zagoni's bodyguard who were killed. And what you see here, I'll read it for you. This date that this happened was October 28, 1861, 5 days after Zagoni's charge. Zagoni went back to camp, and then Fremont, with his infantry, managed to take Springfield on the 28th. So he had this ceremony, and the night before this ceremony, the story is that some vagabond had slept in what was then the courthouse, and it burned that night. But they had the new courthouse built and ready to go. If you go to Springfield, there's a old Harris department store now on the site of that courthouse, which served Springfield for many, many years. And just incidentally, right about here is where Dave Tutts stood when Wild Bill Hickok put a bullet in his chest after the war. Anyway, so this depicts October 28, 1861, and again, it was published much later. I can count how many days there was between October 28th and November 2nd, and that's the next date you need to worry about. But there's only 3-4 days. When that time came, well, a little more background on that score. Lincoln and his supporters didn't want Fremont to undertake this campaign. And in fact, before the campaign started out of Tipton, the Secretary of War visited Fremont, and he had in his hand an order signed by Winfield Scott that relieved Fremont from his command. Okay. Now, the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, was an abolitionist from Pennsylvania, whereas Lincoln, of course, was trying his darndest to let that issue come to the fore at that point in time. And the reason he was adamant about that, Lincoln was, is that he had to worry about Kentucky and Missouri going into the Confederacy. So the great emancipator, I'm saying, in November of 1861, really wasn't Abraham Lincoln. And it was much, well, the Fremonts themselves towed the abolitionist line much more than most of the people in the army. What happened is Cameron showed him the order relief. Fremont supposedly pled with him, oh, please let me chase down now. Sterling Price had left Lexington and he was heading as fast as he could to get down to Arkansas. But Fremont said, well, give me one chance to catch him and bring him to battle. And so Cameron, I guess to everybody's detriment, said, okay, I'm going to take this back to Washington and let's see what you can do. But Fremont set off on October 14th from Tipton, Missouri. It took him, 11 days to traverse those about 110 miles, which was extraordinarily long. But in the meantime, in my humble judgment, Fremont built a bridge in a town called Warsaw that didn't need to be built because he wasn't going to catch Sterling Price. So he already knew that. But anyway, once the word got back to Lincoln, it didn't take long that Cameron did not serve the papers on Fremont. Lincoln got called one of his friends, Sam Curtis got involved. And they got another guy to say, take this paper, go find Fremont, give it to him. Well, one of the interesting things about this is, Winfield Scott stopped being the General-in-Chief of the Army on November 1, 1861. And guess who became General-in-Chief of the Army? George McClellan. Samuel Curtis had enlisted another friend of his to take the paper down to Springfield, where Fremont had been, find Fremont, give him the paper. Well, and he did. He found him on November 2nd. He first of all had to go to a secondhand store in St. Louis to get a disguise, so he dressed like a farmer, went and found Fremont, told the guard at Fremont's tent, I'm a local guy and I got some news and I can't tell anybody except the general. So he got into Fremont's tent and then he had this order in the lining of his coat, he pulled it out, and that was the end of Fremont. However, that order had never been reissued. Okay? The order originally was dated October 7th. That was the one that Cameron showed to Fremont and Tipton. When he got served, as it were, the date had been crossed out and changed to October 24, but when it was served, I'm speaking like the lawyer that I once was, Winfield Scott was already no longer in command of the Army. So, I don't know, I guess you all decided maybe Fremont's still the general of that Army. case, oh, I just want to wrap up the question I posed to you originally. Hopefully this is where you want to ask some questions, okay? There's a doctrine in maritime law called the right of prize and capture. What that means is if you're at war and you, in maritime law, you capture a vessel that is fighting against you, you have a right to have that vessel condemned and to put into service for, I guess, whatever army you charter, or navy. This, I got a small image here from one of the weekly news because it's not a good image, but it's not there to show anything other than these were the boats that when Fremont's predecessor took the army to Jefferson City and then on to Boonville, he unloaded his army from these 4 boats just opposite, just east of Boonville. I've highlighted J.C. Swan, but I want you to note also the Iatan. Okay, back in May, of the incident at Little's Grove happened on May 10th, but about May 22nd, 1861, the Iatan put a load of soldiers on board and went searching for the J.C. Swan, because the J.C. Swan was the boat that brought the armaments to Camp Jackson. Under maritime law, that would be reason for a prize and capture. And so that's exactly what they did. When the Iatan arrived, I calculated it about where Herculaneum is. They found the boat pretty much deserted, the J.C. Swan. It could not go south because the river had been closed to floating traffic. So it had nowhere to go. And they found it, and there were, I guess, a first mate and a couple of deckhands. That was all that was there guarding the boat. So they take charge of the boat. Lion sees to it that it's condemned, put into the service of the Union, which is what happened here. And then for the coup de grace, let's say, the deckhands captured that day included Hiram Reed, the man I mentioned first off. He's the first man freed by the military authority in the United States. And this is a picture of him with some of his GAR buddies. That's as good a picture as there is of Hiram.
So when they captured the boat, they freed him, is that what you're saying?
Well, he was free because there was nobody controlling his whereabouts. I think he probably was still a member of the crew of the boats when they went up. But nobody knows. I don't know. But what happened was on September 10th, Fremont had issued an order that personally I think was ordinary type of an order under military circumstances that had the effect of saying, hey, if you're fighting the Union Army and you own slaves, we're going to take those slaves away from you. Now, the precedent had not yet been set that those slaves could then be free. But what happened was with Hiram and another deckhand that were both owned by the same man, who was certainly in rebellion against the United States. Fremont wrote out manumissions, okay? And oh my goodness, did that upset Abraham Lincoln. And he delivered them, and Hiram Reed was from that day forward free. Now, the question that I will leave with you, and then I want to get on to the questions and answers, is can a man owned as a slave by another, be freed for the same reason that the J.C. Swan was condemned and taken into Union custody?
That was my question, because the Confiscation Act had not been created until 1862.
The second one was created in
Well, the
the
second
first
one, but the first one, first Confiscation Act was dated when?
It happened in July of '61, right when Congress came back into session after. And it was somewhat vague on the question of human property, but what it said was that if you employ a slave in work in opposition, like Fort Sumter, to our government, you can no longer, and you want to enforce that slave's labor, the courts are not allowed to hear you. Okay? The word back in Washington when all this was unfolding was that, oh, that Fremont had done something extraordinary. Well, no, he didn't. He said, these men, now he was mad at Lincoln, so he poked him in the eye here, but he said these men were taken off a boat owned by a man who was adjutant general for Sterling Price, and a boat that was co-owned, at least, well, actually, Hiram Reed had been raised in the family of Henry Shreve in North St. Louis. And one thing that was happening at that time in the Civil War, at least in urban areas like St. Louis, where there were slaves, is that basically for decades, slave owners in the city would hire their slaves out to work on steamboats. An interesting comment was, I can't pronounce it because it's French, but the guy, I never took French. He's a guy, he visited all over the United States, and he wrote a big long book about his visit to Coyville. Thank you. He said that once the Germans and the Irish came into St. Louis in mass, that people no longer had any use for the slaves because they could use the immigrants cheaper than they could for daily housing the slaves. But in any case, Hiram Reed's family, as it were for generations involved in steamboating. There he is, he's on the boat that delivered the marble to Camp Jackson, and so Fremont freedom. Now, what happened that makes, I hope the whole story a happy one, one of Fremont's friends who had come from Nantucket said, I'm going to take Hiram with me, I'm going to visit Nantucket. He takes him to Nantucket. Hiram lives there, he joins the DAR, and he's an officer from time to time. He lives on Nantucket Island, Massachusetts for 50 years after that manumission paper, before he finally died. And he was, the first man or woman freed in the history of America on the authority of the U.S. Army. So anyway, I add that to Archer's this. Anyway, questions, please. Yes, ma'am.
So you didn't really discuss much about Jessie. What happened to her all this time? Fremont was out fighting. I mean, what happened when you got through? I mean, did they live happily ever after?
You said she was living in St. Louis most of us, right?
Yeah.
What was the address again?
Where they live?
The corner, it was.
Oh, the headquarters. It's at Shoto and 8th Street. Just a hop, skip, and a throw from Old prison.
Two blocks down from that jail.
Yeah, and, yeah, actually, they did live there also. Jesse and John were writing back and forth. They must have used couriers because it was happening. Jesse wrote a book in 1863 called The Story of the Guard. And it's about the bodyguard, and what it was a propaganda piece, frankly, because all of what went on during the war and after the war was all one person's propaganda versus another's propaganda. And I think frankly,
Sounds like we're in the same
yeah,
boat.
yeah. And Jesse was just excellent at that task, and Fremont had his people, and of course, the Blairs had theirs. But no, they were writing back and forth. I'm convinced, based on one letter in particular, that Fremont knew, and Jesse knew, he was never going to outrun Sterling Price. In fact, what I was going to say, he sent Sigoni when they were 50 miles out of Springfield. He sent him ahead with the bodyguard and Frank's, the other guy's people, and they rode all night for 50 miles so that they could arrive on the anniversary of the charge of the Light Brigade. And that's what happened.
But then they'd be exhausted. They'd be exhausted.
Yeah, well, but I mean, that's the kind of propaganda I'm talking about that was going on. But that letter I mentioned, Fremont says in a letter to Jesse, I agree basically what you said. They're working on base motives, et cetera, but we're going to, it was a very hopeful letter, which I read to say, hey, I'm fired. As soon as they catch me, I'll be gone. But I'm going to run for president again. So, anyway, yes, she was involved in pretty much everything John did.
Well, Jessie was running along in different newspapers. She was being serialized. She was very, very popular, right? And she could make anybody sound in any way they want. She done a lot of that for not only Fremont, but also with Kit Carson. Because Kit Carson had been earlier, before the Civil War, his best friend. But all the things that they went through out west, Kit Carson plays a second role to Fremont, all because of the way Jesse spins the story.
Sir.
You can write your next book on her.
This battle that was fought in Springfield where 20 men were killed, would this be considered a skirmish, or was this a planned battle? It's called Zagoni's Charge?
Yeah.
Was this a plan?
Yeah.
Okay.
What had happened, again, I'm editorializing a little bit. Again, I've got something about my book coming out in October, so it's covered in full in that. But it's, he sends Zagoni and he sends Frank Weissman out there so that he can say he caught Price and did back. Okay? That's why he did it, because that's what the Secretary of War had given him an opportunity to do. It was a magnificent charge, frankly. And I think it was the first cavalry charge in the entire Civil War. This is October 25, 1861. And probably the last cavalry charge ever where sabers were the main weapon of the attacker. So they ride up this hill and they chop them. And all the Confederates that were in Springfield, frankly, people had been recruited and they were trying to catch up with the main army that was heading south for the winter. This was the first winter of the war. So the whole thing it wasn't really a campaign. It really wasn't a battle. It was all, I guess, John Fremont Pat himself on the back.
Saber thing, is that like a Hungarian thing?
Yeah, oh yeah, I think, yeah, and, Antigone became very, very famous. Obviously forgotten now, but I hope, well, again, it's not just the battles and the campaigns, it's the intrigue going on all at the same time. And again, I'd say, I wrote the book because of what I discovered by having read, but all the stuff you can fill in between, it's just, I guess most people in the rest of the country never heard of Castle at Springfield. I feel like running there. Yes.
When you referred earlier to a collection, you called it, I believe, the Hecker collection?
Becker,
Decker, okay.
B.
State historical?
That's with Boston College. If you look up
Boston College.
the Becker collection, oh yeah, it's a treasure trove. And there's all kinds of drawings from artists in the East and everywhere else.
So when did Fremont make the emancipation order to free all slaves or rebels in the state of Missouri?
What the order said, now this was, let me see, it was,
Was it after this 100-day period or?
no, it was
Before?
August 28, 1861.
Okay, so before.
Yeah. And,
That would have caused a huge ruckus, right?
well, again, what the politics of it became something kind of different than what it started out to be. Fremont's order was in two parts, okay? The first part declared martial law in a wide swath of Missouri, mostly in the Northeast, because of the problems that John Pope was having up there with people burning railroads and stuff like that. Then he clomps on to this thing that whoever owns a slave who's used, and it really starts almost exactly the same language as the first confiscation act, that they're free. And that didn't raise the firestorm that people later detected that it did. Okay, in fact, well, Jeff Thompson, who as you all know, when he blew up over that thing and he wrote his own copy, freeing the slave, what he mentioned was, his words were that I'll hang, draw, and quarter each minions of Abraham Lincoln for every basically Fremont had said in the order that if you're in this area under martial law, if you're caught with a firearm, you can be executed. So that was shocking. But again, my theory is it wasn't that big a deal until, well, what happened was his wife had been up to see Lincoln and fight with Lincoln in the Red Room, and she found out then that Montgomery Blair was on a train heading to St. Louis where he was going to basically try to fire her husband. But when Fremont heard about all that happening, he said, well, here, I'd already issued this order. Let's just free a couple slaves. But again, it made history, but in terms of what was going on at the time, it was not a surprise.
I've been reading some of Bates' letters and correspondence and discussion with his family back home and with his son, Barton, about this whole episode. And I believe, according to what he wrote in his letters home, at first Lincoln wasn't against the part about the martial law. He only wanted him to retract part of it. And he gave him an opportunity to do it, and he wouldn't do it. And when he didn't do it, and he got fired, he didn't go to Lincoln himself, he sends Jessie. And Jessie was the maddest because she'd been traveling and traveling and traveling on the train. She gets into the White House and Lincoln snubbed her. He wouldn't even shake her hand. So
Well,
Jessie hated Lincoln.
everybody wound up hating everybody else. So it wasn't just Union versus Confederate, it was Union versus Union in particular. Fremont didn't help things with his manners and he just was but again, in this particular instance, I guess the lesson is there. Well, and again, speaking now to our African American cousins who helped win that war, St. Louis in particular, and not include St. Charles in that, was a very, very unique place here in the state. Because in 1860, St. Louis was the 8th largest city in the United States. And that's counting New York and Brooklyn as separate cities. And the only city in a state where slavery was allowed in that group of 8 was New Orleans, and it barely eked out St. Louis. But New Orleans didn't have Illinois across the river or Iowa over here, so that all of the litigation and all the controversy about the Scots and everything else just bubbled up in St. Louis. And I think, frankly, we should be proud of our legacy in that regard, because despite what the Supreme Court did to the Scots, we had a system that was working. Obviously, a time had come for emancipation, and I guess what interests me about the Fremont story is the time had not come for Abraham Lincoln, but the time had come for Jesse. Yeah. Anybody else? I will ask you please to take a picture of the QR code and give your review. They expect
Should we pass out your comment?
I left some out there that have a QR code on. And again, I'll be happy to answer some individual questions if you have any, but thank you for coming.
Thank you.